Thank you, Brian, for such a rich and thought-provoking introduction. It is my privilege now to chair the 3 papers that will comprise of this first panel of the symposium. We will hear from each of our panelists for 20 minutes, before then moving on to open up the conversation for further discussion. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand over to our first panelist, Jonas Narchi, who will be speaking on the Trinitarian origin of plurality in creatures. Achard of St. Victor's De Unitate et Pluralitate creaturarum in the light of Trinitarian Ontology.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I brought a presentation, so I'll try to speak sitting down and use the presentation if that's okay.
If you want, you can do it if you want.
Well, I can still actually.
Okay, I'm happy with the paper. Go ahead.
That's no problem. I can do straight against it.
Okay, good.
Well, thank you very much again for your kind introduction. I'm very grateful to be here and to be invited to speak here and present some of the results of my ongoing PhD project at the University of Heidelberg concerning Trinitarian thinking in the 12th century. I'll now be speaking about Achard of St. Victor and his work De Unitate et Pluralitate creaturarum. I know it's rather unknown, so I'll say something about him beforehand. Now, in the Trinitarian Ontologies Symposium last September, many speakers, especially Jonas and John Milbank, stressed that the main contribution of the Christian dogma of the Trinity to philosophy, particularly ontology, consists in the elevation of the concept of relation. While the Neoplatonists saw relation as a merely deficient and inferior category, in comparison to substance, Christian theology, starting with the Church Fathers, found relation at the very core of God and the world. Now, what was very striking to me when listening to these papers and comparing them with medieval scholastic debates on the Trinity was that another metaphysical problem raised by that dogma remained somewhat in the background. For medieval thinkers, especially those deeply embedded in the Platonic tradition, mainly the Victrines and the school of Chartres in the 12th century, the Trinity was first and foremost the paradox of unity versus plurality. Ever since Plato, the ontological problem of how a plurality of beings can originate from and coexist with the radical oneness and unity of God has been at the core of metaphysics. While pagan Neoplatonism tended to overemphasize ontological unity to the point where all plurality and diversity of creatures seem to be a privation and lack of true being, modern and postmodern ontologies often seem to dissolve the world into a plurality of standpoints with no unifying principle whatsoever. Now, this current situation poses both a challenge and an opportunity for Trinitarian ontology to demonstrate how all being, in its unity as well as in its plurality, is grounded in God's own unity in plurality, that is, the Trinity. In the following, I will outline how Achard of St. Victor, a 12th century Austin canon and bishop, offers a valuable starting point for the ontological grounding of the unity and plurality of creatures in the Trinitarian God. In his long-lost work, De Unitate et Pluralitate creaturarum, translated On the Unity of God and the Plurality of Creatures, discovered in a single manuscript in the 1950s, Achard developed a unique concept of the Trinitarian God. I would like to present his thought in 3 parts. First, after briefly introducing the life and works of Achard, who remains virtually unknown to this day, I will apply Julian Maspero's distinction and speak first of Achard's ontology of the Trinity, so what is God in itself, or in himself, and then Achard's ontology from the Trinity, that is his doctrine of creation in a Trinitarian light. Let us turn to Achard of St. Victor's life and works. Now, a short note on his name. Achard is the Norman, medieval Norman version of Achard, so in a way we could also say Achard or something like that. And as a German, for me, that's very funny because, of course, I think first of Meister Eckhart, so in a way, this is the Meister Eckhart of English and French philosophy. Because he was born in England around 1100, and Achard later joined the Austin canons in the famous Abbey of St. Victor near Paris. There he became the Victrine's second abbot in 1155. He later went on to become the Bishop of Avranches in Normandy, where he maintained close contact with both King Henry II of England and his Victrine brothers in Paris. He died 10 years later in 1171 and was buried in the Abbey of La Lucerne, where his relics are venerated to this day. Now, from his time in St. Victor, a series of 15 mystical sermons, a treatise on the soul, and the De Unitate and Pluralitate survive. In his writings, Achard combines Platonic speculation with monastic contemplation. Not yet. Sorry. While his sermons are mainly concerned with the spiritual journey of the soul towards God, his philosophical writings concern central questions of metaphysics, especially ontology. I say philosophical, but the term theological would be just as accurate. In the famous words of Etienne Gisson, the 12th century can be understood as the honeymoon of philosophy and theology, la lune de miel. The clear distinction of these disciplines, a divorce if you will, would be alien to the works of Achard of St. Victor or any 12th century thinker for that matter. The borders between philosophy and theology, between faith and reason, were not drawn yet. They were indeed the subject of severe debates between the schools and the monastic orders. As a result, many thinkers of the 12th century dared to search for a rational understanding of the Trinity that would have been regarded impossible or even heretical in later centuries. In a way, the 12th century could serve as a starting point for a new Trinitarian ontology in our time. Let us now turn to Achard's work, De Unitate Dei et pluralitate creaturarum. Written around 1150, there is no trace of this treatise until the 14th century, where it is cited by the Franciscan theologian John of Ripa. Only in the 1950s, a partial copy of the work was discovered by Marie-Thérèse d'Alverny in a 14th century codex from Padua, Italy, containing mainly the works of Anselm of Canterbury. It's very interesting because first they thought it actually was Anselm of Canterbury. Finally, in 1987, Emmanuel Martineau published the work in its entirety and offered a French translation. And an English translation of all Achard's works was published by Father Hugh Feist in 2001. My citations of Achard will be from this collection. Now, already in the first sentences, Achard designs an ontology of the Trinity. The theoretical question of how a plurality could arise from the perfect unity of the divine has occupied metaphysics since antiquity. This is just for historical context, but if we see the scholastic time, there we have a different kind of controversy. It's the Trinitarian controversy. So this old question takes a new form, even a political dimension. The question of the Trinity was at the heart of religious controversy, both inside the church and outside the church. For example, in the 11th century, as you know, the Filioque controversy had divided the entire church. In the time of the Crusades, the Trinity was one of the main bones of contention between Christians, Jews, Muslims, and heretical groups emerging everywhere in Europe. Now, the existence of any plurality in God seemed to endanger the very fundament of monotheism. Thierry of Chartres, whose thought heavily influenced Achard of St. Victor, for example, used the following formula: no plurality in deity, nulla pluralitas in deitate. This is just a classical formulation of that rule. Keeping this in mind, one cannot help but be shocked when reading the first sentences of Achard's treatise, because he begins with a very puzzling proposition. In creatures, no true plurality exists because there's no true unity. This sentence seems to be utter nonsense. I'll repeat the sentence. In creatures, no true plurality exists because there's no true unity. Now, we would somehow expect something different. We would expect, as good Neoplatonists, for example, we would expect something like, in creatures, no true unity exists because there is plurality. But he writes something else. What does Achard even mean? He writes, true plurality vera unitas. Vera pluralitas, that's the whole point of the argument. He writes, true plurality, vera pluralitas. Now, what is that? We understand the meaning of true unity, it's a unity without parts. But what is true plurality? Let us follow Achard's argument further. He writes, plurality is nothing else than multiplied unity. This much is clear. However, unless somewhere true plurality is to be found, there will not be any plurality at all. It is impossible that plurality exists unless it is or imitates that true plurality. Now maybe we can grasp what Achard means. There are two kinds of plurality according to him. One highest form of plurality, vera pluralitas, it's closer to unity somehow, but we still don't know how, and a derived plurality that merely imitates it. Achard continues, it cannot imitate true plurality unless the true plurality exists. Hence, it, meaning true plurality, exists. However, it cannot exist except where there is true unity, and no true unity exists except in God. There, meaning in God, true plurality and unity must reside. Now, already in this first chapter, this is the entire chapter of his book, Achard has laid the foundation of an entirely new ontology, where plurality is not negative, it's not a negative privation and lack of being, but it's self-grounded in God. But before we can turn to this ontology, let us sum up this complicated argument. It's a bit complicated, so I try to visualize this in the next image. I hope it works. Yeah. Okay, so there should only be good plus of this, but that's okay. Okay, so in general, two kinds of plurality can be conceived. I think every time you click one comes up. So two kinds of plurality can be conceived. True plurality and a plurality that imitates it. Now, we still don't really know what these are, but these are the first that he distinguishes. Plurality is defined as unity multiplied. This means that true plurality is true unity multiplied, which for us doesn't make any sense because true unity, of course, can have no parts and cannot be multiplied. But we'll see later how this works. Now, therefore, this is the first conclusion, true plurality can only be where true unity is. And there is no true unity in creatures, therefore there is no true plurality in creatures. You can show all of them if you want. So, we are right here. There's no true plurality in creatures, but obviously there is plurality in creatures. I know that we see it all day long. So, what kind of plurality is there? Of course, there's only one left. The plurality in creatures can only be a derived plurality. Okay, derived plurality, but can only exist if there's true plurality it imitates. This is what we know already. So, true plurality must exist, and it can only be where true unity is. Why is that the case? Because we have said that it's only true unity multiplied. And there is true unity in God, therefore there is true plurality in God. Now, that there is true unity in God, Achard writes that he has proven this in another chapter of his book. Unfortunately, we've lost this chapter, so the book is incomplete and we don't really know how he proved that. Wants to prove that, but we can be pretty sure that it's a classical argument for monotheism that he derives. Now, reading this intricate argument, I know it's very difficult and very complicated. We might say, well, where's the Trinity in all of this? There's no Trinity anywhere. So, let's look at how this implicates the Trinity. He's written that, this whole part we've read. The last half sentence that he's written is very interesting for us now. He writes that true plurality and true unity must reside, but not in the same respect. Non secundum idem. So here we come into the question, how is the unity of God connected to its plurality, or to his plurality? As one might expect, unity is predicated of God substantially. That much is clear. Therefore, the plurality in God, using the principle of non-contradiction, cannot be substantial. Otherwise, we'd have 3 different gods, for example. Also, it cannot be accidental. Why? Because God has no accidents. According to Achard, there's only one possible plurality left, a personal one. Therefore, the true unity in God is substantial, and the true plurality in God is personal. This, however, is still not the Trinity. We still have to prove that this personhood is Trinitarian. So in order to do so, Achard develops an argument based on another aspect of the created world that we read in the next chapter. So, the aspect that he finds is similitudo, the likeness. He writes, nothing which does not in some way imitate the true and highest unity is or can exist. Some sort of likeness exists between every creature and that unity. This likeness is partial and imperfect. So this much is pretty clear, it's Neoplatonic. However, nothing is called imperfect except in relation to something perfect, the perfection of which it fails to attain. Therefore, there exists somewhere in it something, the full and perfect likeness to that unity. Since this likeness cannot be a creature, it necessarily exists above the creature in divinity itself. I think we are very zoomed in on the whole thing. We can only see part. I think if you just... Otherwise. one moves in, so yeah, that's, yeah.
It's not going down, no, sure.
It's not, okay. We can move it more to the left. Sorry.
Is that what you meant?
No, that's
drag. Yeah. Shrink it, not drag.
Well, we can't make it any longer, I'm afraid. We can't.
Okay, you can't show up.
No, it's not working that way.
Okay,
All I can
I'm
see.
sorry. But you have the paper with you, so yeah, I hope you can still follow me anyway. Now, let's visualize this argument that reminds me of Anselm of Canterbury's argument in the monologian, where he also distinguishes different degrees of perfection. Achard arrives at the proposition that in God there's not only true unity, but also a perfect likeness to that unity. So now we're getting close to the Trinity. More precisely, this likeness has to be thought of in a triadic way. It can only be thought of as first, unity, this unitas, then second, of what is equal to unity, it, quod unitate est equale, and third, the relation of equality that binds these two together. Having found this triad in God's unity, we can now understand in what God's plurality exists according to Achard. It is the relation of unity, what is equal to unity, and their connection, namely equality. This triad is then, in the last step, identified by Achard with the Trinitarian persons. How? Of course, unity is identified with the Father. That is equal to unity is the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the one that proceeds from both of them and unifies them in their equality. Some of you may know Thierry of Chartres has a very similar argument. He writes of unitas, equalitas, connexio, but it's somehow different. I think this one is better because in unitas, equalitas, connexio, we have both connections. So the Son would be a relation and the Holy Spirit would be a relation of unity. And then basically what we're saying is that we either have two or four persons, but we can discuss this in the discussion. Let's turn to Achard's ontology from the Trinity. So how is this an ontology from the Trinity? That is his doctrine of creation. Now we immediately see that we have already learned quite a bit about the plurality of creatures when analyzing the plurality in God. The reason for this is fairly simple. For Achard, the analogy between the true plurality in God and a derived plurality in creatures is so strong that both ontologies imply each other. We can only understand the plurality and diversity of creatures when we realize that it mirrors and imitates the true plurality in God. In his paper last September, Giulio Maspero used the London Underground warning "Mind the Gap" as a metaphor for what Trinitarian ontology ought to do. It has the difficult task of at once minding and bridging the gap between God and creatures. We can now rephrase this metaphor and ask, how can we bridge the gap between God's unity and the plurality of creatures? How is it possible to derive an ontology from the Trinity? Now, Achard's answer is very interesting. Not only does he use a very similar metaphor of spatial distance, he also arrives at a conclusion that could be called the Trinitarian ontology avant la lettre. He writes, now this is only Latin, I'm sorry, but I'll translate it. The plurality of creatures is very far from the highest unity, so that it cannot adhere to it immediately. Not only is it far from it because the former is plurality, while the latter is unity, but also because the former is temporal, while the latter is eternal, the former is finite, while the latter is immeasurable, etc. So the former is created, the latter uncreated. Reason requires that besides this plurality, which is far removed from God, there be some superior plurality, which coheres immediately to that highest unity, and is, so to speak, intermediate between that unity and this plurality. Sorry. Let us visualize this argument that presents a sort of mind the gap by Achard. I hope, yeah, you can all see it. Okay, that's perfect. There seems to, first of all, be a gap between the true unity of God and the imperfect plurality of creatures. Now, God's true plurality, we see it in between them, is precisely what bridges the gap between divine unity and the plurality of creatures. Why is that the case? Because it is at once intermediate plurality, pluralitas mediata, and mediating plurality, pluralitas medians. This is because of its ontological status. It has its eternal and uncreated character in common with true unity. There it is fully in God. But it has its plurality in common with creatures. In this way, it constitutes the missing link between unity and plurality. In a way, it's the missing link that Plato has searched for, and that the Neoplatonists always have searched for. It's the connection of how a unity can bring forth a plurality. And this step has severe implications for the doctrine of creation. It helps us to better grasp what it means that the world in its entirety is created by God. The German historian of philosophy, Theo Kobusch, has coined the term ennoblement of plurality, so Nobilitierung der Vielheit, to express Achard's accomplishment here. The emergence of plurality out of unity is not a series of unfortunate events where unity is lost in a confusion and privation of matter, but a direct manifestation of God's own being. As such, plurality and diversity is willed and created in the same way that unity is willed and created. In my opinion, it is the task of Trinitarian ontology in our day to further develop the metaphysical implications of this doctrine. And with this, I turn to the conclusion of my paper. It seems to be the consensus among proponents of Trinitarian ontology that the Christian dogma of the Trinity has profound implications for how we understand the nature of being. However, it cannot always be clear what these implications are. The question is, what does the dogma of the Trinity contribute to metaphysics, particularly to ontology? In my paper, I've tried to show how Achard of St. Victor, a 12th century philosopher and theologian, would have answered this question. In his treatise De Unitate et Pluralitate creaturarum, Achard argued that the Trinity as both true unity and true plurality is the origin of both the unity and the plurality or even diversity of creatures. While I was not able to give a full account of Achard's theory, I only covered the first 3 of a total of 71 chapters of his book. I would like to raise a few open questions that I hope we can discuss today. Now, first of all, how are we to understand the daring assertion that the ontic plurality of creatures has its origins or origin in the personal plurality of God? This seems to be an error. How can a personal plurality even bring forth an ontic plurality? And what consequence does this have for other disciplines of theology and philosophy? How, for example, do we have to rethink the human person created by the Trinitarian God? In the end of the chapter, or in the end of this paper in general, we come back to the closing remarks of Vittorio Hösler in his paper on Augustine and Hegel last September. Hösler pointed out that a major flaw of Hegel's reading of the Trinity is that he seems to overlook the fact that the Trinitarian God is not only subjective, but intersubjective. It is no coincidence that Hösler mentioned the name of Achard's Victrine brother, Richard of St. Victor, in this context. The Victrine account of the Trinity, be it Achard's or Richard's, urges us to reflect on the fact that the very fundament of our world is an interpersonal communion of love. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonas, for presenting your reflections on Achard of St. Victor. I really look forward to discussing some of those questions you raised in the discussion. Next, switching gears, we will now hear from Joshua Heath, who will be talking about Trinitarian Ontology as linguistic ontology, the case of Sergii Bulgakov.
Good morning. Thank you, Brian et al., for organising this, and sorry to all of you for what's to come in the next 20 minutes. Listening to Professor Pickstock earlier today about the timeliness of thinking about the Trinity in a time of crisis, I was reminded of some remarks made by Sergei Bulgakov about his namesake, Saint Sergei of Radonezh. Saint Sergei of Radonezh, he observes, was born and lived his ministry, what took place in Russia during the time of the Mongol occupation and plague. And Bulgakov remarks that in a time like this, of course, the love of people grows cold. And so it's especially appropriate for God to send Saint Sergei, who in his life as a Trinitarian life was able to bring some kind of succor. I think the same can be said for Sergei Bulgakov, who developed his profound reflections on the Trinity and what Professor Pickstock talked about, that indestructibility of a Trinitarian creation in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, Second World War, the loss of his children. And so I think it's particularly timely now that Bulgakov is finally getting the attention in academic circles that he deserves. He's long been recognized as a major influence on some of the great European theologians of the 20th and 21st century, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Louis Bouillet, and more recently, and here in Cambridge, Rowan Williams, but with the translation of his major and minor dogmatic trilogies, among other works, into English by Boris Yakim in the last few years, his works have become considerably more widely read and indeed appreciated. And his writing on the Trinity, especially as we find it in the beginning of his major dogmatic trilogy, has been a focus of particular appreciation and attention. I believe that it was some of it was discussed at the main New Trinitarian Ontologies conference last year. I intend to focus less on the recently translated major dogmatic work from the 30s, and more on a few texts written largely untranslated from the 1920s. These are The Tragedy of Philosophy, a book, another book, The Philosophy of the Name, and a long article, Chapters on the Trinity. These works constitute quite a profound reflection on Trinitarian dogma through the prism of language. He establishes in them an understanding of the Trinity as linguistic that runs right throughout the major trilogy. It's assumed in it. If you've read it, you'll remember that he often refers to the Son as the predicate of the Father as subject. And it's in these works that he really lays the groundwork, does the heavy lifting, as it were, for that understanding of the Trinity. And I also want to show how the result of this linguistic understanding of the Trinity is that we end up with an understanding of the fundamental structures of creation as linguistic, i.e. we end up with a linguistic ontology, if you will. In this way, I see Bulgakov's thought, any kind of Trinitarian ontology that arises from it, as providing a major resource for theology, especially as it tries to engage with conversations in philosophy and the natural sciences concerning the proto-linguistic or proto-cultural dimension of non-human life, and even of the inanimate world. I won't talk about that very much. Indeed, this whole paper is a bit of a diorama, so apologies if I break your neck by moving too quickly through things. It's more to kind of lay crumbs in the forest for conversation afterwards. So, Bulgakov begins the first volume of his major trilogy, The Lamb of God, with a section entitled Created Spirit. And I would like to begin by thinking about two sections, two elements of that opening chapter. The first is the clarification in linguistic terms of what Bulgakov means when he talks about spirit. More precisely, Bulgakov defines spirit in terms of the constitutive elements of a grammatical proposition. Spirit, he writes, is above all personality, as personal self-consciousness, as an I. This I, he continues, is a living I, the subject of a certain objectivity, the subject of a certain predicate. So in talking about spirit, Bulgakov has in mind that kind of life which we call personal, and he seeks to clarify what is distinctive about that kind of life by defining it linguistically. The fundamental structure of personal life is manifest in the form of any given proposition, i.e. in the unity of a subject with its predicate through the copula, or the verb to be. Already, the remote implication of this is that linguistic activity is distinctive of personal life. And this not in the sense that speech is one thing that humans can do and that non-persons can't do. Rather, language is distinctive of personal life in the sense that all of a person's activity becomes intelligible only when understood linguistically, even if the person in question doesn't happen to be using words. To clarify that, I'll give you a quote from the Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe. Language does not only distinguish man, sick, from other animals, it distinguishes his animality from that of other animals. Man does not just add speech onto those things that he does, such as eating and sexual behavior. The fact that these latter occur in a linguistic context makes a difference to what they are. The second element of that opening paragraph to which I want to draw attention is an assertion that at first and indeed subsequent glances seems to be somewhat shocking in its confidence. Quote, such a definition of personal spirit concerns every kind of spirit, divine, angelic, and human. So that linguistic propositional structure is characteristic not only of human life, but of divine life as well. This is why Bulgakov feels he can begin this section on created spirit by referencing an act of divine self-disclosure, namely God's naming of himself to Moses in Exodus 3. Personal self-consciousness, he writes, is essential to the nature of spirit. I am who I am, Jehovah, says the Lord. And the question becomes, how does Bulgakov feel able to make this assertion that the life of God and the life of human beings possesses this common fundamental structure, and that this structure is proposition. The answer lies in the citation from Exodus. For Bulgakov, personhood and the fundamental structure of personal life are the object of revelation. Indeed, throughout Bulgakov's corpus, one finds often repeated the assertion that ancient philosophy did not know the concept of personhood. Indeed, even the early church he considers deprived of an understanding of personhood which hindered its theological endeavours. So if we understand ourselves as persons, then this self-understanding is the historical product of a relation with a God who first reveals himself as personal. We understand ourselves as persons by relating to a primary personal reality. Indeed, it is precisely the possibility of a relation between God and humanity that discloses to us our own personhood. When God names himself to Moses in Exodus, when God speaks his own I, a mutuality is established which testifies to the likeness of humanity to God, indeed of humanity's status as itself the revelation of God in its personal life. Quote, "The possibility of divine condescension, of a meeting of divine personality with human personality, testifies to the real divine likeness of humanity. The eye of God in the mouth of God, as it is turned toward the human, and the human you turned to God, is the direct expression of this divine likeness." Bulgakov goes on to note that this is the foundation of prayer, and prayer is something that I'll hopefully return to towards the end of this paper. And this revelation of God and of ourselves as personal culminates in the Incarnation. Quote again, "The self-revelation of God as a person runs throughout the Old Testament and is completed in the New, where the personal, theanthropic self-consciousness of Christ, turned toward the personality of the Father, fully reveals God as a collective personality." Indeed, Bulgakov sets God's naming of himself to Moses in the Old Testament alongside God's naming of himself as Jesus in the New Testament. In the latter name of Jesus, both God and humanity are named together, testifying to the inherence of human personal reality in the divine. The name of the God-man is the name of God for humanity in an entirely particular and novel sense, for it is also the name of humanity, penetrating the very depth of its essence. End quote. So Christ is the fullest revelation of God and humanity as personal realities. But this revelation of Christ as personal is also the revelation of the personal as Trinitarian. We have already heard that the revelation of God as personal in Christ is the revelation of God as a collective personality, as Christ's self-consciousness is realized insofar as it is turned toward the Father. Meanwhile, Bulgakov emphasizes elsewhere that the Incarnation was the revelation of the Holy Trinity. The Son manifested the Father and besought the sending of the Holy Spirit. Thus, the name of Jesus, in which humanity also finds itself named, is, quote, the name of the Holy Spirit, in its unity as concrete, threefold self-consciousness. So we must return to the proposition, that fundamental linguistic structure of personal life, and ask, in what way is this structure Trinitarian? And then exploring Bulgakov's Trinitarian understanding of the proposition, we will also better grasp how this propositional schema is ontological, embracing the whole of creation. The proposition is understood as Trinitarian by Bulgakov in two ways, and the coordination of these two ways in Bulgakov's thinking is a troublesome thing for him, I believe, and that's something we can return to afterwards if we like. The first way in which the proposition is Trinitarian is obviously its tripartite structure. There's a subject, there's a copula, there's a predicate. And Bulgakov maps each of these three onto the different persons of the Trinity. The subject is the Father, the predicate is the Son, the copula, the Holy Spirit. And the second aspect, the second Trinitarian aspect of the proposition, concerns one element of it in particular, and that's the grammatical subject. For beneath the apparent singularity of the I, we find that the I is in fact a shorthand, a kind of symbol for a dynamic relational not, an I, you, he, she. And that this I, you, he, she is not derivative, it's not the coagulation of three distinct I's, but that is the primary personal unity. And the individual I is itself derivative, a kind of, he writes, the shadow of a certain primary we. So to turn to that first one, the tripartite structure of the proposition. In Bulgakov's several treatments of the propositional structure of created life, he begins by contesting the viability of any understanding of the I as a simple unity. Such an understanding of the I as a monad is continually broken upon the concrete reality of personal life, as that reality is manifest in thought and language. In neither thought nor language do we find anyone ever just going I. Rather, the I is always spoken, always thought, as part of a proposition. At the foundation of self-consciousness, Bulgakov writes, lies a threefold moment, a triunity, which finds expression in the simple judgment, I am X. This triunity is fundamental, and Bulgakov rejects any attempt to deduce one element of this unity from the other two. We can't deduce or unfold the predicate and the copula out of some kind of primordial subject, nor does subject emerge out of an all-encompassing predicate, the world. They're given together as a primary unity in difference. And what this means is that the I cannot generate its predicate, its nature, out of itself. This content is given to it, and it's given to it as the world, such that the subject's self-definition, including every act of thought and speech, is always an ecstatic act of self-identification with the world as the subject's predicate. So the propositional scheme of personal life comes to embrace the world, understood as the predicate or nature of the subject. Neither world, or the not I, nor the subject, the I, are themselves without the other. So long as it is bare self-consciousness, the subject lacks reality. It is trapped in what he calls the mirrored cell of its own solitude. And although it contains within it the postulates of a reality beyond it, that reality is not given with the bare fact of self-consciousness. Quote, the world as reality is not in it, that is the I. The object is not in it, but only the object's place is designated within the subject. Likewise, the world, quote, remains dead and darkened without the sun of the I igniting above it. Thus, the complex unity of the I with the world, the proposition, comes to be seen as the fundamental structure or unity of all creation. And in this sense, Bulgakov redefines substance as the metaphysical triunity which finds expression in the proposition. Substance, the most basic unity of being, is triune, and so the life of creation constitutes the revelation of a triune God. Indeed, it's worth quoting here a passage from von Balthasar, which demonstrates, I think, the deep affinity between these thinkers. And that quote comes from the Theologic, Volume 1, page 253. The search for the unity of being is at bottom a search for God, and at the same time the recognition that no creature is God. And I want to dwell on that second half now. At the same time, the recognition that no creature is God. Because for Bulgakov, the refusal on the part of humanity to recognize that it is not God, that it is not absolute, is precisely the reason why the triune, propositional understanding of substance has eluded philosophy for so long. It is the reason why philosophy must be considered a series of tragic failures. For if philosophy has sought a simple, monistic definition of substance, then this is because reason, the philosopher, seeks to be a monad and occupy the place of God. The philosopher fails, Bulgakov writes, because he wanted a system. In other words, he intended to create, logically, a world out of himself, out of his own proper principle. And he goes on to quote Genesis 3:5, you will be like God. The monism that thought has claimed to discern in the world is in fact the reflection of the egocentricity of the thinking subject, understood not as a particular instance of pride, but as that pattern of isolation and self-assertion that characterizes the life of fallen human beings. And here Bulgakov at once nods to Kant's idea that the objects of knowledge are constituted by the knowing subject, but in so doing exposes the fundamental irony of a way of knowing that seeks a view from nowhere. For insofar as thought seeks a view from nowhere, seeks to set itself outside and above the world, it ends up seeing in the world nothing more than its own reflection. So the egotism of the human subject expresses itself in relation to the world as a refusal to have the world, to have its nature, given to it. The human subject refuses to let itself be limited by the world as given, and seeks instead to set itself up as creator with respect to it. And in this way, the Trinitarian structure of being is obscured. But this egotism is primarily expressed in relation not to the world, but to other subjects, as a denial of the intrinsically interpersonal nature of self-consciousness. And this interpersonal constitution of self-consciousness is that second Trinitarian dimension of the proposition that I mentioned earlier. For while it is possible, at least in abstraction, to posit a self-consciousness without a predicate, to just say I, in fact what Bulgakov argues is that this I depends upon and includes other subjects. He says this is the magic, the mystery of grammar, that actually in the personal pronoun we actually find all the other ones kind of given to us, such that the we constitutes the kind of the primary personal pronoun. As in the case of the not I of the world, Bulgakov attributes a constitutive role to the other on the grounds that it confers reality upon the I. The you is described as the shadow of the I, giving it an opacity and solidity. But that I-you dyad is insufficient, and if any of you have read Florensky's The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, you'll recognize this as a kind of reworking of his own Trinitarian deduction of self. The I-you dyad is insufficient. It is a mirroring self-reflection, with the you limited as a self-reflection of the I and vice versa. So what's needed is a breaking of this mirroring by the she or the he, who frees the you from being merely a reflection of the I. I as an I see a relation that doesn't include me, and in the solidity of that relation I find my own solidity. And this interpersonal quality of personhood is what conditions our access to truth for Bulgakov. It's that interpersonal nature of self-consciousness that means that we can know at all. It guarantees the objectivity of our judgments. Indeed, in the Tragedy of Philosophy, Bulgakov frequently insists upon the necessary presence of the other for the corroboration of the objectivity of our judgments, such that our knowledge of the world, its quality, reflects the condition of ourselves in relation to other subjects. Indeed, it is only as we seek to fully realize our nature as interpersonal subjects, fashioned in the likeness of the Trinity, that the world can truly reveal itself to us as Trinitarian. Quote, to free oneself from subjectiveness, that is being just one subject. This means to be a collective I, that is a true I, to be in the truth, and so to know it. It means to be a true subject who does not distort its predicate, that is the world, but allows it to freely reveal itself in them. So our apprehension of creation as Trinitarian, our knowledge of creation, forms part of the ascesis, the self-renunciation that is required of every Christian. It is an act of self-denial, with self-denial understood not as mere privation, but in fact the realization of the true Trinitarian nature of personhood, personhood as an identity established not through self-assertion, but through the other. And here I would like to conclude by drawing our attention to the figure of the saint, or the ascetic, who appears intermittently in these texts from the 20s as the instantiation of a new, distinctly Trinitarian epistemological paradigm. The saint is the one who devotes themselves to a life of self-denial modelled on the life of Christ, with that life understood in turn as the perfect translation in a human life of the eternal establishment of identity through self-renunciation of his love, that is the life of the Trinity. This work of self-denial is primarily the work of prayer, understood as a dialogue, as the immersion of the created I into the you of God, the finding of one's own I in the I of the Trinity. And as the egotism of the I is subdued, the ascetic's vision of creation is transformed. The experience of the saints, Bulgakov writes, qualitatively differs from the wisdom of this world. For in it creation is known not from without, but from within, not in the mauvais infini of Kantian experience, but with the inner I in wholeness and unity. This vision of the unity of creation is a vision of it in the Trinity, as a living vestment of the Godhead, as the Word, clothed in the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Finally, we are going to hear from Erich Groat, who will be talking about zero is a creature, ex nihilo, language, and the Imago Dei.
very much for the opportunity to speak. I am a substitute for someone who sadly can't be here due to a family illness, and so I'm grateful to be able to help out and hope that what I can put together can be a sufficient substitute for what we're missing today. I've taken a paper of mine and I'm reversing the order, I think, because I believe that this order of presentation will fit in 20 minutes, whereas the other order will not. So I'm going to start in a way that I didn't intend to. The name of the talk is Zero is a Creature, but the fundamental ideas here are not necessarily mathematical, but also linguistic. Linguistic, however, in a much more under-the-hood mechanical kind of way, which gets to a little bit of mathematics. So it's a little different in spirit than Bulgakov's approach to language. I'm going to write a few symbols on the board here. And I'm going to leave them there because we're going to come back to them and I want to show how they're connected to each other. And then we're going to put a sentence on the board. So here's a sentence of the English language, in terms of a grammatical sentence. And it has a very straightforward ambiguity to it. It's a very simple ambiguity. It's not subtle at all. And I think you can all see what it is. It's a very structural ambiguity. So there are two readings here. The scout saw somebody. Who did he see, or she see? The boy with the binoculars. That sort of was a unit, a constituent of some kind, right? So that's one intuition about this sentence. But there's another one, which is that the scout saw the boy. How did he see the boy? Anyone? With the binoculars, exactly. There's something structurally different about these. The phrases are grouped together in different ways. Now, you have probably encountered along the way, probably with bad memories associated with middle school, diagramming of sentences like this. And if we think of this as being composed, we have a subject, which is a noun phrase, a sentence made out of two things, noun phrase and a verb phrase. Well, we have the noun phrase is also made out of two things, the scout. And now the verb phrase, let's think about the first interpretation first. The first, we had a verb, which was saw. And then we had a noun phrase that was kind of complex, right? It had the boy, but it had a third thing in it, with, and this stands for noun phrase and prepositional phrase. There's another noun phrase, binoculars. Is this legible? Can you see this? So you can see some patterns here. We have a noun phrase is made out of an article and a noun. Here's another noun phrase made out of an article and a noun. Here's another noun phrase made out of an article and a noun, and something else. In fact, with most theories, there's some slightly more articulated structure there. We don't have to go into it. So this kind of a system gives us a structure like this. But what about the other reading? Saw the boy with the binoculars. The with the binoculars is somehow describing the action of the scene, right? It's not describing the boy himself, it's describing the action by which the boy was seen. So, something different is there. It's as if this prepositional phrase is not a part of the noun phrase, but a part of the verb phrase. Right? So things are clustering together differently. Now, the perspective that I want to take is that of the generative grammar program, which began around the 1950s, mostly with work of Noam Chomsky. And this was an approach to language which grew out of the structuralist tradition, but is much more a cognitive project. In fact, Chomsky uses the word Cartesian linguistics, which is a little bit misleading because there's no necessary Cartesian metaphysics to this. The idea is simply that we're thinking about language in a very narrow sense in terms of what it is as a human biological attribute. Just like we might just study, for example, the liver or the heart. What is it that the human baby has when it's born that gives it this kind of capacity? And we develop systems that are sort of rule-like to describe what it is when you know a language. And the question of rules has been a little bit ambivalent, and we end up with these things like, oh, okay, a sentence is made out of a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. A verb phrase is made out of a verb followed possibly by another noun phrase. So, see the dog, resemble the chicken, feed the poor, and so on. So these are very general symbols, and a grammar is kind of a collection of these symbols. Well, this works very well. You can describe languages very well this way. However, what is difficult to describe is how people learn languages this way, because different grammars have quite different systems of combination. And it's very difficult to see how a child can accumulate the systems of rules that they need to in order to understand their particular language and be able to generate sentences of their own language. So as the decades have progressed, this system of complicated rules with names of nodes and branches and ordering of operations is all very complex. The question has been re-raised in the last couple of decades is, what is the minimum amount that we need to say about a language in order to accommodate structures like this? Can we weed out some of this ugly stuff? Well, I can't go into the whole history of that for these purposes, but what I will say is that what seems to distinguish human language and the ability of humans to construct mental objects like this is basically something very simple. It's an operation that's called, in the literature, it's called merge. And merge takes two linguistic objects, whatever they happen to be, puts them together into one to create a new linguistic object. And the idea is that the base is the words of the language, or the morphemes of the language, the individual parts of words. And you put them together. So, for example, for the sentence that we have, let's take the first reading of the sentence. We would have the word the and the word binoculars. Now, we can merge them. And we create a set. In the mathematical sense of set, we'll come back to that in a moment. We create a set. There's no order here. There's no actual word order. That's a sort of a secondary effect that is language specific. And then we have with. Aha! We have a new linguistic object here because we've merged it. I can merge that with. And then we've got boy. And then we've got the. And then we got see. And then we have, what was it, saw, right, in past tense. And then the and scout have already been merged separately. And then you merge that together with this. So what we have is this process of just putting things together over and over again. Right? It's a recursive process. Now, of course, this is endless. There is no limit to this. There's no longest sentence in the English language. One could always embed something further. Say, John said that they saw a boy with binoculars. You can always embed things and always make things larger. Now, it looks like this capacity that we have to generally take a linguistic object of some kind and merge it over and over again, it gives us the fundamental human capacity for language. So we can arbitrarily create these structures any way we want to, say things that we've never said before, say the opposite of them simply by inserting words like not, and so on. This seems to be a computational kind of operation that no other animal has. And so it appears to be distinctive to the human species. Other animals do not have this. There's also the question, I should say, by the way, of what words are. Words themselves seem to be something that other creatures don't have. I believe it's closely related to this, but we won't go into that at this point. So what we end up with are a very abstract object here, and a very abstract operation that simply says, take two things, put them together, and you have a new thing. Well, I want to suggest something actually more than what the scientific literature has said up to this point. I want to say that this is actually a much more general operation, and I want to call it call as one. And I believe that this capacity simply to take two concepts from almost any domain, bring them together into one thing, regardless of what they are, is pretty much unbounded in human thought. Now, to what extent such an object is going to be useful, is going to be interpretable, that's another question, but our ability to do it is pretty much arbitrary. In fact, if you think of what a word is, going back to Aristotle, Aristotle's notion of a word is a sort of a pairing of form and meaning. You have here form, pardon my terrible handwriting, coffee was a little too strong this morning. Form and meaning. These are really quite different realms. Form is sort of acoustic signals and physiological reactions to things, perhaps symbolic figures and so on. And then meaning is a very abstract conceptual idea of which we have really no understanding, at least as far as cognitive science goes. And yet here they are, stuck together in a word. So the capacity of the human to do this is extremely important. I believe that this calling as one also, because it is unbounded, we are able to create this infinite set of structures. But we are also even to refer to itself, the notion of calling as one. We can take, for example, any concept that we have, and we can consider the concept. We can generalize over concepts. We have a concept of the concept. Now, arguably, animals have concepts of a kind too. Like there's a notion that a dog has of other dogs, notions that dogs have of human beings, and so on. But there seems to be no kind of universal reflectiveness. So I think that human universals come out of this. And in fact, I think that the very notion of predication is also deeply related to this, and this is something that needs to be looked into. But I'm going to stop there with this. Now, I'm going to suggest something a little odd, and this goes back to the title of the talk, which is, what if we don't have anything at all? Can we call it as one? I think we can. I suggest that we can. And let's say we do that with sets, as we do when we normally use language. Well, I have a set and there's nothing in it. It's an empty set. Now this is curious, because this leads us directly to a mathematical idea of the empty set, which is foundational in set theory. Set theory is an attempt to basically ground mathematics in nothing but objects that are collections of other things. And to get the ball rolling, we need something which is itself without a set. If I have a set, let's say A, and it's made out of things, little a, little b, little c, well, in mathematics, these also must be sets. So this guy has got to be made out of x, y, z, and so on. So does this, so does this. Well, that can't go on forever. There needs to be some kind of a ground. We need to start with a set which has got nothing in it at all. So this is a kind of a foundational axiom of set theory, in the mathematics of set theory. There are further axioms that tell you how you can build larger sets out of smaller ones, very reminiscent of the idea of merge, of building things and putting things together and calling them as one. So a very interesting talk. Let me see what the time is doing. When do I have till? 7 minutes. Let's begin with the void. We begin with the void. What is there? There's nothing there. The only thing we can say is there's nothing there. So let's say nothing. Beginning and end of speech. There's nothing there. Well, that's pretty much the same as this bracket with nothing in it. There's nothing there. There's an emptiness, and this is the symbol for the void. Now, for Badiou, this is a very important part of his ontology, because for him, ontology itself is essentially set theoretic and mathematical in nature. Now, I'm not fully Badiouian, but I'd like to take that as a kind of a starting point, just use that and sort of exploit it as one of the fissures, in the sense that Ryan was talking about. And point out that we have here a kind of a word without any intrinsic content, because it doesn't begin with any situation. Now, in Badiou's thought, there is a notion of a situation, a reality, a being in the world. And these beings are always sets. They're infinite in size, infinite in complexity, and infinitely different from each other. And that is a situation, a particular situation. The event for Badiou is a kind of a transformation of one situation into another in a kind of an unpredictable way. But this is also a kind of an event. This is the declaration of the existence of something. And it's not dependent on any previous situation. And I think that this is exactly what we mean by ex nihilo. Now, Badiou himself has noticed this. This is not a terribly novel observation. But it's very interesting to see how, beginning with absolutely nothing, and simply the act of saying what is there, we can construct infinitudes. So, for example, all right, We begin with the void. What is there? Nothing. Well, now I have a word that says nothing. What is there? A word that says nothing. Oh. Now what is there? Oh. The nothing and the word that said nothing. All right. Now what is there? Oh, nothing. The nothing that was said, and this thing. There's a kind of iterative quality to this. And in fact, you can define the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, in precisely this way. And this is a formal way of grounding what the natural numbers are. In which case, what you get is 0 rather than 1. This is inaugurating kind of a new way of thinking about the beginning of number, beginning not with 1, but beginning with 0. That 0 is simply the empty set. 1 is the set containing 0. 2 is a set containing 0 and 1. 3 is a set containing 0, 1, and 2. So conveniently, the number of elements in each of these sets is the number as we think of as the number, right? This has got nothing in it. This has one thing in it. This has two things in it. This has three. Now, the numbers do not constitute all of reality, obviously. There's more going on than this. But the point is that our capacity to formulate this notion of 0, which I'm going to write like this as the empty set, our capacity to see this allows us to see something about the notion of ex nihilo. This is a word, in a sense, that needs to be spoken. It is the Logos speaking on behalf of the divine in the void. So my claim is that 0, in a sense, is a creature. Not only is it a creature, it is the first creature. It's the first way of the word being able to apply itself to the void. So if there is nothing there, what is there to say but there is nothing there? And with that, the word is now open to the world, and a creature now exists that we call 0. So I think ex nihilo and this notion of 0 show us something. They begin to bespeak the Trinity in a certain way, because we have speech, what is said, and someone that says it. Now let's bring this back again. The reason I think this is anthropologically interesting in a way is that the human mind has this distinctive capacity that no other creatures have. Other creatures communicate, other creatures even use vaguely symbolic systems, but none of them have this general capacity to, in a sense, sit away from a situation, call what is there one, and proceed on that basis of a concept of those things being one. And then exploring it, seeing whether it's true, whether it corresponds to anything. And that particular capacity, in a sense, brings us not simply to our capacity to do mathematics, but for the very possibility of mathematics at all, which is what set theory gives us. So it seems to me that with the incredible cognitive sophistication of the development of animal life, and especially of primate life, something interesting happens in the human by which the mind returns to a fundamental creative act, the fundamental addressing of the word in the human mind, therefore in the human spirit, which is ex nihilo. And in that sense, human language, the innovation in human language of this syntactic ability to call as one, is a very important part of Imago Dei, because we thereby participate in this fundamental creative act from an absolutely minimal starting point. Let's see. Yeah, in a sense, the notion of the first word is a sort of a kenosis, but it's a kenosis of the void. The void crosses itself out and allows itself to be spoken. And this gives us a little piece of something. It's the first piece of matter in the material world. And in a sense, it's sort of the dust that bespeaks the word in creation. That's all.
Right, thank you so much, all three of you, for the papers that you presented. You certainly gave me a lot of thoughts to work with, and I'm sure all of us as well. So now it's time to open up the discussion to all of you guys for questions, as well as just for further comments and such. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the not Hebrew, in Genesis 1:2. So the word was, the world was void or empty and void. So I'm not sure if you have.
Yes, oh yeah. The word is translated in different ways, but absolutely, yeah. Yeah, the Spirit worked on the surface of the waters and on the void. And I think that those are metaphors, essentially, for the Nihilo that ex nihilo speaks of. The notions of chaos are also important. Chaos is interesting, etymologically related to the word gap. So I'm not exactly sure, but there is a Indo-European root ga, simply ga, and it means gap, and that's where we get the word gap. It's also where the word chaos comes from in Greek. It is also where the word yawn comes from in English, so a yawning gap. So these are conceptually all very related.
Thank you very much for the talks. I have a question also for you and for Jonas. So maybe first a question for you. You named the zero a creature, but it seems to be that the nothing cannot be avoided. So is creation necessary for God? That would be my question. And for Jonas, so the triune structure you present us of equality seems to have an inner necessity. But at the same time, you spoke in your concluding remarks about intersubjectivity. Doesn't intersubjectivity presuppose contingency between the persons, freedom of every pole in itself, whereas the triune structure of equality seems to bind the persons necessarily together?
I'm glad I didn't get a question.
Oh dear. Lucky man. That's a very interesting question concerning the necessity in the sense of nothing. It seems to me that a way of thinking of this is that, of the non-necessity, is that God did not need to remain silent about nothing. God is utterly full and replete and completely actualized at all times. And so the notion of nothing, in a sense, cannot stand before the actual logos that expresses it. So there, in a sense, there's something a little bit misleading here about presuming a void which is then named, but it's a gratuitous naming that actually allows any void at all to be conceivable. Because God, before creation, in a sense, is already entirely actual. There is no a priori notion of nothing. The nothing emerges when we simply speak anyway, in this gratuitous act of creation. So I think the time metaphor of, oh, now it has been said, is always a little misleading because it suggests that there's something before. I don't know how good an answer that is, but that would be my response.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. It's very interesting, and I'm a bit baffled. It's very difficult to answer, but I'll try. So the first thing that medieval thinkers, especially Achard, probably would say, is that for God necessity and freedom are the same in a way. They fall together in his good willing. So in a way, necessity is there, but it's a different necessity than the necessities we suffer from. So that would be one answer, but I know it's not satisfying. So the second one would be that I think you're right, contingency is implied in personhood and difference is implied because I need to be different from the other person. But in a way, I could also argue the very fundament of personhood needs to be a necessary plurality. So there needs to be a plurality. There needs to be this possibility of equality. Without this possibility of equality, there would not be any difference. So in a way, we're just circling each other. I'm saying mine's before yours and yours before mine. In a way, they're probably co-eternal in a way. So if you turn to Richard of St. Victor, from Achard, away from Achard to Richard, he would say that personhood works in this way. Personhood is free and necessary at the same time, because charity has to be thought of in a triadic way. Charity is loving, being loved, and loving again, and then the condilectus of the Holy Spirit that is loved by both Father and the Son. And these are, in a sense, different and contingent, because there is this freedom of love between them, but in a sense they're also necessary, because this is the necessary structure of love. This is the necessary structure of personhood. So yeah, but I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but that's my try.
Well, thank you so much for these papers. I wanted to ask a question for Joshua, if I may. So you were in the middle, and for instance, you were mediating the two extremes of our papers. That is, there was a question about the unmediated and mediated plurality that we opened up with, and then there was also a subsequent question about how it is that the possibility of language emerges from the void as it's spoken. And in the discussion you gave of Sergii Bulgakov's Trinitarian grammar, you suggested an answer to this, I thought. But the answer was, very interestingly, not something that could be captured statically by any kind of mathematical or linguistic formula. Rather, it seemed as though you said that it was dynamic and relational and even perhaps dialogic. That it had to be shared within an entire linguistic community. And ultimately that community was substantival in the sense that it was captured by the substance of the world. And the substance of the world was itself linguistic all the way down. But I mean, there's a certain sense in which even this substance, I thought, was something that had to be spoken as though it were ex nihilo. That is, it couldn't be sort of latent out there, but it had to be enacted, it had to be performed. And perhaps this sense of freedom that we're describing is this creativity that emerges through this act of speaking.
I agree with Ryan. Yes. Gosh, where to begin with that? Certainly, Bulgakov is very interested in the idea that creativity is a quality of every kind of, all human self-definition is a creative act, and that in that creative act there is what I'm not always convinced by Bulgakov's negotiation of freedom and necessity. But it comes down to something very similar to what you were just talking about. You know, he will say, and very similarly, that we have as our task that we cannot avoid the growth into our intersubjectivity. We just can't abnegate from that, because that's what it means to be a person, and that freedom arises in the various forms in which that intersubjectivity is realized. So I think he tries to put, as it were, freedom and necessity as typically understood, kind of on different conceptual levels. But certainly to come back to what your question about their unity that can't be expressed linguistically, what I would have talked about had I had more time is that alongside this picture of knowledge as a schisis, there is a corollary picture of language as a schisis. That good theological writing, good philosophical writing, has to undergo some kind of ascesis in order to express this model of identity that is in fact that goes against the grain of human created subjectivity, right? Insofar as in philosophy and theology we're trying to get at this Trinitarian structure, or in the case of dogmatic theology, the Trinity, and that is kind of ungraspable according to the structures of reason which for Bulgakov proceed monadically. We can't, it proceeds by steps or moments, as it were. And so he does give, at various points kind of indicators as to what a good theological and philosophical language looks like, and it is one that is replete with antinomy. For example, you find that in The Lamb of God. He will say, I just can't express this any other way, because this is how theological language has to work. But interestingly, I think and this kind of anticipates the panel on poetics, I think that there is a lot to be said for metaphor in here as well. Insofar as what we're trying to do in this ascesis of knowledge, this ascesis of language, is renounce this model of static identity. The kind of predication that comes closest to expressing an identity in difference would be metaphor. And in this way, I think Bulgakov is very interesting in conversation with analytic understandings of language, which tend to put metaphor as a kind of exceptional act of predication. It works because it doesn't work like normalized predication. Whereas for Bulgakov, actually, metaphor is the truest kind of predication. And an understanding of the proposition as A equals A is actually a deformation of what language is really for. So there are some thoughts in response to what you said. Yes, no, I found your invocation of set theory very interesting. There is another 20th century Russian philosopher theologian very interested in language and the problem of names called Alexei Losov, who, in addition to writing on Plato, Aristotle, the Areopagite, Husserl, the philosophy of language, he wrote quite a lot on mathematics, and his view was that in many ways set theory had important dogmatic implications, because it was important for understanding what's going on when we talk about a name. He says, how is it that I say that the name of Jesus is, for example, is on the one hand just a sound. It is that particular moment of saying the name, and also the entire actuality, the entire energy of the second person, or indeed of the Trinity in one. And he said that set theory is a way of grasping a name as at once a concrete thing in itself, but also one that is a totality of agency, right?
Yeah.
So for him, there was a lot of work to be done in exploiting set theory for a proper theological understanding of names. And I just thought that was an interesting.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have anything to say to that?
Not really. Well, one thing I think that testifies to. I think a radical openness that one needs to have toward the idea of the set, which he explores. When you're looking at things purely mathematically, I mean, in Cantor's work in developing set theory, there are nothing but sets. Everything is sets, and then you define things on top of them. But you begin with sets. So because you begin with sets, you end up with nothing but this empty set at the bottom. All form is extrinsic to that. But as I showed with the example of the word, there's in a sense no difficulty of putting together two completely different conceptual domains into one thing.
No.
And the human mind can do that. It doesn't have to be an idea, right? So thinking of sets as the expressions of ideas, which Cantor did, going back to Plato, that's not a necessary component of what a set is. And I think that the notion of name really shows that. It shows, here's this kind of arbitrary notion of sounds that we have. It's not totally arbitrary, of course, but you can kind of individuate it as a linguistic potentiality that you can say or conjure. And in the same set contained with that is the entire story of the Trinity. and the whole church is contained in it. And it's a set.
That's exactly how Losov will kind of look at a name, in fact.
Yeah.
He'll say a name is in fact a set of you've got actuality and then the form of actuality, and they are two distinct things, and then in fact actuality is further decomposed into, say, form and matter. And so yes, there is this this identity indifference goes right the way down. I think Bulgakov I think Bulgakov doesn't need to say that the proposition alone is the kind of originary moment of that kind of identity indifference. We can, as you showed with the word, kind of find it.
Yes, you can.
There is no big yes.
Yeah.
Yes, on this one, I just wanted to ask, so Jonas, you mentioned previously that the contradictio of the divine love is that which shares the mediating plurality that is shared not only in divine life but also amongst creatures in creation. And this suggests that neither the set nor the proposition can be fundamental to the way that we think about how difference is mediated or plurality is mediated. Not to say that they aren't important constituents of possible modes or sites of mediation, but that is that they can't be the fixtures of it. They can't constrain the possibility of mediation. And it also suggests that there's something internally differentiated about, and perhaps even that requires mediation in order to even think the proposition and the set. And I think Sergii Bulgakov is very helpful in this regard because he points to how the proposition doesn't really have any focal meaning except it's already mediated through its own grammar and the meaning of its terms, and how moreover that is always mediated through everything else. It's what Bradley described as an internal relation of all of the terms. And so I wonder whether we might have to open up beyond the notion of the set or of the proposition in order to get back to the mediacy even of the set and the proposition. And that's where you went.
Maybe I can say something, Ginny?
No. Sorry.
It's okay, I can use it. Okay. I think it depends on which part of reality we're talking about. I think my paper was mainly concerned with the Trinitarian Ontology in a way where we say it's an ontology of the Trinity. And you were talking more about the creatures and about creature or how a creature even comes to exist. So in a way, these can work together, or must work together. One implies the other, or especially the ontology from the Trinity implies an ontology of the Trinity. With Achard, we would say that even before the zero and before the set, there has to be a one, and then there has to be a plural.
Of course, yeah.
Because he learned with Thierry of Chartres, and he learned at the Chartreuse school, so he had a lot of mathematical analogies of the Trinity, and he knew them, but he didn't really use them. I don't know why, but in a way he didn't want to focus that much on the unity, because the Thierry of Chartres would simply say, well, we don't need the zero, we have the unity, or the one, and if I multiply the one with itself, then I have three parts. I have one, I have the one that results from it, and the one that combines them in one equation, so I have the Trinity. And Achard does not do that. He wants to add to that plurality, to that unity, that it always has an inner structure of plurality. So in order for there to be zero, there has to be one, and not the other way around. And that's where, for example, most of postmodern philosophy would not go with him, and Meister Eckhart would not agree, Hegel would not agree, Heidegger maybe, I'm not sure about Heidegger, but that's interesting because I think we've lost this, and it's not in our side anymore.
Could I just add something to that? I think, yeah, I'm not sure that I would agree completely either, because I think what I was looking at is a kind of halting point, kind of trying to find a minimum within a style of philosophy that people are now looking into by UN ideas and sort of revival of Plato and mathematics. If we look at kind of the minimal grain there, which I claim is really de Chardin's grain of thought in a sense, that minimal element there is not a description in any mathematical sense of the Trinity, but it bespeaks it in a sort of a way, right? It's not an attempt to answer any questions about the oneness or the threeness, which is true about God.
Yeah.
It's to say that in the first gesture, we can get a hint at something. It's almost more like I'm not sure I'd call it metaphorical exactly, but it's sort of multisensory.
It's what Augustine means when he says there are vestiges of the Trinity.
Yeah, vestiges.
Yes, it feels like the translation of Trinitarian agency. You know, it is a form of agency that looks like this in creation, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Any other?
Yes, so Joshua, you had mentioned in your talk that for Sergii Bulgakov there could be no view from nowhere, no point at which we can speak of the world except as it's already spoken. And this seems to point to, in a certain sense, back to Achard's like Victor, as well as beyond the a priorism of Cartesian and Kantian idealism, to a sort of infinitely linguistic, but also dialogic and always relational conception of how it is we come to speak and know about the world, so that there's no way we can speak as it were from an absolute zero or from a void that is not something that's already spoken and already given to us in the speech that we make of it. And I think this actually comes into some point of conflict with, maybe tension with Erich Groat's paper, because, I wouldn't say that Erich Groat is endorsing a kind of Badouian conception of a constructive set theory that emerges from the event and the situation in which it's constructed, as they were constructed from the zero of the null set. But it does seem to suggest that we can only begin to, as you say, we speak the logos that is spoken to the Trinity in the constructive activity of linguistics and mathematics within a dialogic frame that's already spoken and in which we're already responding to the speech that's given to us.
I mean, I just want to say, yes, sure. What is the problem that I have to think about?
Well, so what I'm wondering is whether there's a connection with Achard St. Victor prior to the movement to modern idealism and a priori attempts at speaking, as it were, from nothing or from nowhere, as though we can speak about being or about language prior to the way we encounter it in our speaking about language, and whether in a certain sense Sergii Bulgakov and the rest of sociologists are pointing back to that as a way of recovering it. and whether this points to an alternative to the way that perhaps Badiou had naively endorsed a sort of mental situation of set theoretic constructions of all linguistic practices, in such a sense that even for Badiou there has to be a kind of dialogic activity of exchange by which these events are enacted in linguistic practices. Would you agree with that? Would you think Sergii Bulgakov would endorse that, just out of curiosity?
I think, I'm never quite sure what Bulgakov would say, and I'm never sure I understand it when he does say anything. I'll talk a little bit more about this, like this, you know, what I see as Bulgakov's problem with a view from nowhere. Because in the philosophy of the name, written in just around 1920, Bulgakov is keen to see a Trinitarian, a complete Trinitarian pattern of life in non-personal creatures, right? So the tree outside has a Trinitarian mode of existence insofar as there is the noumenal aspect of the tree, there is its name, its phenomenon, and then there is the unity of identity. So there you have a Trinitarian picture that I can observe from outside. By 1922, when he writes The Tragedy of Philosophy, Bulgakov has renounced the idea that I can simply observe instances of the Trinitarian life happening out there. He says that when I predicate tallness of a tree, greenness of a tree, even though the form of that judgment is A is B, in fact, I'm anthropomorphizing the way in which that tree possesses its tallness. Because I can only speak, or the fundamental form of speech is I am A. So he's very reluctant at that point to say that we can see Trinitarian models of existence simply happening around us. Why do I think he does that? I think because he realizes that you can't, that in so doing you reinstantiate precisely the picture of knowing that he has a problem with. And in this sense, I think there is something of an Augustinian tendency there to look for that Trinitarian modeling in our own activity, right? So the only way to apprehend the Trinity is by being ourselves, right? And so in that sense, it's very much an involved way of knowing, and certainly one that he would say comes out of a prior address. Certainly, he describes the entry into personhood, the state of personhood as a response to the divine having already spoken your name, right? So in that sense, certainly we find a picture of knowing where we've already been given what it is to work with, and the only way to continue running with what we've been given is to stay inside it, as it were. Whether or not that answers your question, I'm not sure.
I'd just like to say we have time for one or two more questions potentially before we head down for a tea and coffee break.
I'll take a shot at it while I'm standing up here. Erich, I just wondered if you had considered some of the sort of Christianizing Pythagorean readings of the Tetractys, the first four numbers, first four real numbers, which sum up to the number 10, the perfect number. And so you see it in...
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
Oh, I'm wondering if you had considered Christian readings of the Pythagorean concept of the Tetractys, which is the first four numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which summed equaled 10. For instance, St. Augustine will use this one to speak of how the will harmonizes all of experience. He also uses it throughout the De Musica. And then Nicholas of Cusa obviously uses it as a sort of, what do you call it, a sort of organizing principle for the De Conjuncturis. And of course, as sort of that Pythagorean influence, he can't necessarily start from 0 because 0 isn't really a number, but there is obviously this sort of attempt to unfold nothingness and unity as well. So I just wondered if you had considered any of those sort of sources for talking about set theory and anything like that.
I've considered them, but I haven't delved into them. And I think part of the reason is that, in a sense, you end up with a sort of a vast zoology. I mean, the ontology, once you allow numbers to begin meaning something, everything can happen. And all of that meaning comes from without in some way, right? So like that empty set that I drew up there, is that the number 0? I mean, well, it's the number 0 because I say it's the number 0 and then I treat it like that. Or is it the number 1? It's the first thing, right? I can call it number 1. There are different ways of proceeding. And you just end up with such a vast zoology that I haven't really thought, well, I should delve into that tradition of it, especially 1, 2, 3, 4, because there's just so many ways you can go with it. But it's a really good reminder, thank you. I will look into it. Does that answer the question?
Okay, so I guess if there are no further questions, we can all head downstairs for the first tea and coffee break, but let's just thank our panelists one more time.